Next, let's transition to a real-life customer of Pursuits, one who's using us every day to build pipeline, shorten sales cycles, and increase their win rates. By now, everybody's heard of Wiz, based on Google's recent massive $32 billion acquisition. But for those who aren't familiar with their business, Wiz is a rapidly growing cloud security platform, one of the fastest 3 companies to $100 million of ARR ever. On the back of that success, Wiz has also successfully expanded into the public sector at both the federal and SLED levels. Dean Scontras is the AVP leading the charge in the public sector for Wiz. Throughout his career, Dean has sold into Fed and SLED for an incredible set of companies like Wiz, Okta, Auth0, Duo Security, Mobile Iron, and HP. Dean, thanks for joining us today.
Mike, thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So the first thing I wanted to ask you about was the structural changes that you've seen in SLED over time. And I want to ask you kind of both sides of the coin. What's the thing that has changed the most, let's say over the last 5 or so years when you're selling? Let's talk specifically about SLED. What do you think has changed the most selling into SLED? And then after that, I'll follow up and ask, what do you think stayed the same?
Yeah, I think good question. I think one of the first things that has changed is the procurement process. Maybe it hasn't been the last 5 years, but prior to, things were almost exclusively RFP, which could take a significant amount of time. Now with the things like NASPO, there's procurement vehicles in place that lead the path to procurement and make that a whole lot easier. That's definitely a positive change. I think sort of COVID also, although not an event we wish to relive, was an sort of expediting force that moved a lot of agencies to realize like some of the technology they were using were antiquated and was forcing function too, which served in a lot of positive ways. Of course, one was which a lot of funding too was now being provided to states and local governments as well. I think those are probably the 2 largest changes in the last 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, totally. And the COVID one makes a bunch of sense. We've seen that show up in the way state and cities and counties are putting everything online now. It's a lot more digital than it used to be. Obviously, still a lot of room to run there. But on the contract vehicle front, do you have any ideas why contract vehicles have taken off? Like, was there some procurement code change, or what inspired that? Have any hypotheses?
Yeah, I don't know what inspired it. Maybe it was the fact that it was, going to RFP was a lengthy process. It was more art than science. Maybe it was based upon, how the government procures with government-wide acquisition vehicles, and the ease of doing that, where all those terms and conditions are already in place.
Pre-negotiated.
And allow that to whiz through like that. No pun intended.
Got it. And on the other side of the coin, is there anything that sticks out in your mind that you thought would have changed, but maybe hasn't stayed the same, or it hasn't changed? It still remains the same?
Yeah, well, for the positive effects of those, I mean, I think it's probably true of all public sector leaders is that we wish what we call time to close, from the time we find the customer to the time that customer procures. I can tell you in one of my last endeavors for deals of between the tier of $500,000 to $1 million, it took 445 days to close, which is long. So that still remains a long pole in the tent. And the 2 longest poles in those tents are, finding the customers, right? Where are they? What do they need? How do we get to them? Right. The way we do that today is largely through events, and that differs from my commercial peers, which is largely digital. So that remains a challenge. And then I think also, the procurement side of it, getting the contracting piece of it, although we just spoke about this, I can speak from a SaaS perspective. A lot of those, and I've heard this from state CIOs too, that they're not set up legally to understand and get through the legal processes specifically for SaaS, right? So that's generally where we encounter some resistance.
Yeah, and a lot of the terms and conditions are legacy, kind of like on-prem related.
Exactly. Yeah. So we hear our lawyers on one side saying, well, this doesn't apply to us. And of course, and I've heard it from a state CIO not too long ago that, in one state he was involved with, he specifically sought out attorneys and legal counsel that were specifically versed in SaaS. So I've seen a little bit of progress there too, but those are some of the
Yeah, you
challenges
just
for
work
sure.
through it. But I think it's so fascinating because you talk about a 440-day procurement cycle, and then you had a tech win cycle before that, I'm sure too.
Yeah, heroic.
And
Exactly.
and
Yeah.
you know, and then you think about it from the perspective of a CRO, they're like, "Wait, what? We're talking about like 500 days? We're
Yeah.
like a year, almost 2 years? Like we're a year and a half?" Like that that
Yeah.
investment has a long payback period, and I think that's specifically the issue that scares a lot of people away, which I think leaves the
It
public
does.
sector in a worse spot where they have, less innovative
Yeah.
technologies and stuff. So I'm super
Yeah.
excited
We,
about how Pursuit
we
can play a role there in shortening the tech win cycle and the procurement win cycle.
in the defense of all state and local folks everywhere, I think we just commissioned a survey, and one of their major concerns about the move to cloud and cloud security was cybersecurity
Yeah,
personnel. Right? It's harder to find talent at the state and local level, specifically versed in cyber, and that applies to the legal side as well. So there is definitely a shortage of cyber talent at the state and
yeah,
local level, which I think is a noted challenge. Again, I think it was over 50% of respondents cited cybersecurity talent as a large challenge for not only move to cloud but procurement, acquisition, all of
interesting.
it.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense, and that's yet another signal that we can monitor, right? Like who's got cybersecurity folks on their staff, who's got open positions for them. Those things can kind of, be some
Yeah,
tea leaves.
but
Who's in the market?
I think what you said makes sense. I mean, I can tell you there's no worse feeling on our side than deals that take
Yeah,
that long to close. But you've got to set expectations correctly from the front end that,
yeah,
it is a longer sales cycle. But any way we can get involved and use technologies like Pursuit, where we have access to more
right.
data. I mean, that's one thing people in my position always say is, what's the path to procurement? How many signatures are required? Who needs to get involved? How can we start that process
Yeah,
early? So data is always really, really relevant to the sales process. And the more data we have, the more we can be of assistance to our state and local customers.
totally. One related question to something you said earlier. I just want to go back for 1 second, and don't share stuff that's like secret. But I remember you and I had a conversation one time where you were talking about how those cycle times like impact the way you forecast. And I thought you had a really clever way of thinking about forecasting deals that are going to close in this quarter and where they needed to be in kind of the overall tech win and procurement win cycle in order to be a commit for the quarter. Can you share thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, it's probably like most other SaaS companies, is that we have historical data that we use, that we can see that when something gets to a certain point, we know what the likelihood of
Yeah,
success is, and that we call that tech win. We track that, so that I think is pretty predictable, especially at companies like Wiz. Then I think the challenge becomes in that procurement process, which is, again, we are fairly new at this, but having worked with several companies where you've got historical data, where a deal in a certain tier size is going to take a certain length of time. Again, part of the art of this job is setting expectations correctly, where you never want to get out over your skis. But that's the biggest challenge, which is getting to that point in the
yeah,
cycle. I like to make sure that our entire pipeline is at a particular point before we actually have it in visibility for a
yeah,
quarter. The art of the job becomes at that, okay, tech win. And that's really where, becomes a lot more art than
yeah,
science.
yeah. So next thing I wanted to ask you about was kind of the buyers on the public sector side, and you touched on this a little bit, but as more investment has been made in software, and as SaaS and cloud is becoming more common than in years past, how have you seen buyer committees evolve? Like and also who's involved in those? Like do you find that it's just IT? Do you find that the business people who are running a sheriff's office or a police law enforcement agency, are those business buyers involved, and how are they technically versus maybe a few years back? What thoughts do you have on that?
That's another good question, because I think that's changing as well, right? I think um, it's a team sport in sled sales, probably more than in all of public sector sales. because not only do we have technical decision makers and economic buyers and people who make that, but we also have political stakeholders too, right? People probably, I think the ones who stand to lose the most, especially in a cyber incident, are those who are in office, the cabinet agency head or the secretary or the commissioner, or even sometimes the governor's office, which is you never want to see citizen data at risk or, God forbid, a breach. So it's truly a team sport where you've got to work the technical decision makers, the economic buyers, as well as the political stakeholders. And I think as incidents happen across the country, which we don't like to see happen, that stakeholder community gets bigger. So we preach a team approach here at Wiz and everywhere I've been. Certainly, that sales process is much different than my commercial peers because one, it's sensitive. You want to be very cautious, but we want to make sure that we've got buy-in from the top. So I think as of recent, maybe in the years past, it was largely a CIO discussion. But I think more and more as the move to cloud and cyber becomes a lot more important, and also the themes around efficiency and all that other stuff that we're seeing at the federal level, we're seeing a lot more either appointees or political types get involved in decisions as well. So it's always a team approach. I like to say where the vectors add up and you've got the economic buyer and you've got the technical win, make sure we've got coverage up to either the agency level or above at the governor's office as well.
So the next thing I wanted to ask you about, Dean, was budgets and how that's changed. As more spend has gone into IT, especially gone into cloud. Do you have any sense of the overall percentage of budgets at state and local level? I'm sure it varies based on the entity you're talking about, but how has that trended? Has it stayed the same, or do you see it, more investment going into IT and software compared to, let's say, 5 years ago?
Yeah, I wish I could say that I see more budget moving into cloud, and I don't profess to be a budget expert at the state and local level, but I think a lot of it is due to how they calculate costs on data on-prem stuff and data centers versus how they would calculate costs for cloud. I think that creates a little bit of confusion when it comes to looking at cloud over the long term and the cost benefit analysis of cloud versus on-prem. In fact, that popped up in our survey as well, which is state and local is kind of behind the curve when it comes to the move to cloud. And I think there's some general accounting principles not being applied at the state level because they do budget in either 1 or 2 years, and you can't look in the out years and see this cost savings. And that sort of lends itself to being, preferential to on-prem. So the data we see is that state and local agencies are largely a lot more on-prem and data center based upon how they budget and account today. Now, that being said, the trend is definitely a lot more to cloud. I think it was 40% of the respondents said that they have begun the migration to cloud. So I think the two things are very tightly connected. Budgets are always an issue, and they're more of an issue today than they were 3 or 4 years ago. We saw a lot of cybersecurity money being sent to the states in the form of grants. You saw a proliferation of the move to cloud as a result of that. You're always fighting for a share of the pie, somehow, and that's why SaaS AEs do what they do. But it's not so much. And look, I could probably argue both sides of this. I've talked to state CIOs where budget is always a concern, but it always seems to go back to the calculation of how they look at data center and on-prem versus cloud over the long term. And those that see it as a cost savings, a competitive advantage, better for the citizens, are a lot more effective at getting their share of the budget and making the argument to the people who actually control the budget.
Well, that's super fascinating because I remember I had a conversation with someone who used to be high up in IT at IRS, and one thing that person shared with me was that the system that receives all the submissions on tax day was written in assembly language and went live when Kennedy was president. And on the surface, you hear that and you're kind of like mind blown by that. But from the perspective of someone whose job it is to make sure that system works, it doesn't go down. It is super reliable, right? And it can handle the volume, and it's super efficient. And since it's written in a really low level language like assembly, it theoretically requires
It's
less compute. So if you were to just take it, flip it into C or something and put it in the cloud, the argument is that sure, it might be easier to integrate with, and to have extensions and reporting and new features and all those things, but the core might be more expensive, which is interesting. I just heard that thought. I haven't yet gone and pressure
no,
tested it. What's your take?
there, there was actually a really good interview here with a federal agency recently, and they were talking about one of the agencies, similar commercial equivalent, had about 100 to 200 people IT support and about a $20 million budget. In contrast, the public sector agency had 8,000 people supporting that and an annual support budget of 3.5 billion. And a lot of that is exactly what you just said, is the legacy technology that's been around for so long may on paper appear to be working and be more cost efficient. However, in comparison to their commercial peers, it's much more expensive to go on and maintain. And as you think about those technologies, those legacy technologies, the expertise to support them is sort of fading and going away. So, that cost will arrive one day. So I think the challenge is, to get to the commercial equivalent of, we've seen that in Washington recently. You've seen a lot of the anecdotes about, how much it costs to support a lot of these legacy technologies. And there are real challenges on the public sector side. We can go into, or we can speak about, it's easier on the commercial side where you do have a central IT authority that can make decisions unilaterally and everybody must do it. The federal government is a lot more federated in how it makes IT decisions. And therefore you get a proliferation of cost over time, a lot more IT staff. And it's made worse actually at the state and local level. I'll say, to go back into Civics 101, it's more confederated, where you don't have central IT, and then you have localities and communities and counties that actually, the state extends services, sometimes cloud services into those states. And you don't have as much of the stick as you do the carrot to try to get them to buy into the overall architecture, right? So there are real challenges on the state and local side and the federal side that don't apply to the commercial peers that kind of understandably, contribute to the sprawl, the software sprawl, the IT spend, and the support spend. It's not that somebody's sitting there specifically thinking, how can we fleece the American taxpayer? It's also by the way that states and the federal government is organized and how decisions are made. It's a lot more federated.
And I would love at some point to see or do an accounting of what does it cost to run, a system like that is old and efficient, but then when you factor in the services spend on top of it, how much does that actually, in terms of like total cost, what does that look like?
Yeah. I think that, and then the examples out there was, I think it was the Treasury, and was one of the Doge folks said it was, roughly comparing them to the amount of data they process versus a bank of the same size, right? But again, that's a condemnation of anybody. That's just the reality of, the difference between how organizations make and implement decisions at the public sector level versus the commercial side.
Interesting. I'll have to go check that out.
Yeah.
So I want to shift into kind of like how do you talked about like the team that you're working with and how there's a shortage of cyber talent and there's people are looking for it across the country. I think that also goes into how that has implications for how the projects are scoped and designed. And so my question for you is like, how have you seen state, local education entities do this process well, where like they're moving to the cloud or they have cloud workloads and maybe they're not the resident expert in cyber, but how have they worked with the private sector to gain an understanding of what matters and what's important? And then allow that to shape their projects in a way that leads to better outcomes versus like, having the proverbial Chinese wall between public sector and private sector. And obviously there's challenges there because you don't want someone in the private sector to like write the RFP, but you do want to learn from what's happening in the commercial sector. So I'm just curious, like how have folks done that well in your experience?
Yeah, I can speak from current experience where you have an agency or a department, and there's always a lot of hesitancy that we can consolidate costs, we can operationalize fast. I think it's kind of a wash, rinse, repeat proposition. And I can tell you without disclosing names, it's exactly what we're doing. Where the number of people required to support an implementation of cloud is a lot less than it would be on the on a on-prem equivalent, right? I mean, you've got to go in and really do the proof of value, proof of concept to prove that whole thing out. I mean, how would I put this too? Is there is an industry that's popped up around supporting a lot of the legacy IT technology and calling it modernization. It's very disruptive in that respect. That it does sort of disrupt a lot of the dependencies that a lot of agencies have had on outside resources, to provide that support. So I think the good ones take the risk, and again, it's our job to show that it's minimal risk. To do the business value and assessment on the payback over time. I know that a lot of agencies sort of look at those sort of skeptically, like, oh, well, this is something that the vendor has sort of offered out there. But, I think good SaaS companies can show a pretty quick return. And I think this is where it really becomes disruptive, is that you can do it with a lot fewer subject matter experts and TAMs to implement it across. So it's a matter of jumping in. And I think there is a little bit of kind of the only cliche that comes to mind and is monkey see, monkey do, is once somebody does it and the innovation is established and the cost savings is established, then there's a lot of folks that will
Yeah, and
want.
a lot of that I think is common in the private sector too, right? Like uh,
So,
I don't really meet finance people who believe the ROI stories that are presented, like, because they, for the same reason. But you can, like you said, you can provide like the structure, so that
yeah,
it allows you to
that was
think it through.
that was another thing that showed up in our survey, which was there was this dependency upon outside sources to continue to support the legacy technology of on-prem, right? And that does become a revenue stream for a lot of those entities that are providing the bodies that support the legacy stuff. And then you pile on or overlay the challenge with cybersecurity personnel and the shortage of it. So then you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. The third element there is that there's still a large perception that cloud is not as secure as on-prem. Certainly, as Wiz, we say that's not true. It's actually more secure, right? So I think state and local are really kind of caught in that little twilight, which is there's heavy dependency upon outside sources for bodies because they don't have the bodies internally. There's hesitancy to move to cloud, where actually that will reduce the cost of time operations over time because fewer people are required. It actually fixes that problem. So, I mean, it's the $1 million question that you asked originally, which is, where do we see it? How do we see it? It's really with those that are willing to be innovative and do it quickly. And that starts the train sort of running from agency to agency to agency. But right now, I do think we're kind of in this twilight in state and local, especially where they're not entirely there based upon legacy technology, the outside relationships they have to support it, and then vendors like us who come to them and say, actually, this is a better way. It reduces the cost over time. Dependency upon outside sources is not as high, and you need fewer bodies to support
And when we talk to technology vendors who like have an on-prem solution, I've heard a lot of those revenue leaders saying, we're doing this like lift and shift thing from on-prem to the cloud. That they're doing it on behalf of their entity customers. So that's not necessarily a workload that Wiz would protect for the public sector. That's a commercial sector one. But I think that's saying, like, what they're saying is they think that within the next couple of years, that revenue stream, which is relatively easy, it's an existing customer moving from product A to product A.1. It's not that big of a change in terms of the functionality, and you're not changing a vendor. But I hear those revenue leaders saying like, this is definitely, the clock's going to run out on that within the next couple of years.
Yeah, that's why I'm, I think the real marker here for us, because it's going to happen, right? We already see it's going to happen, right? It's revealed in our survey. It's greater than it was 2 to 3 years ago. That's why it's kind of a, more in a motivation on new logo acquisition, to use a inside baseball term, which is, land and expand, right? Because the move to cloud will happen. It's already happening. To get back to your original question, everybody always wants to know who are the latest and greatest customers to do it. How did they do it? So we always try to showcase that. So in the state and local business, that's exactly what it is. It is about new logo acquisition, as many as possible, as soon as possible, as fast as possible, because that's only going to grow over time, because our net retention rate is so great at Wiz. That's the smart way to look at this market right now.
Well, let's one thing I want to follow up on that is, let's talk a little bit. We talked about how deals can take a long time. You think back to deals that have closed relatively quickly, right? And say within a quarter or two throughout your career. It doesn't necessarily need to be with Wiz, although I know you guys have a few of those. What are the patterns there? Like, is there a way to identify a deal that's going to just breeze through in 3 or 6 months? And what's true about those?
Yeah, I've been with 3 or 4 different startups now, and the first question is kind of, I hope this answers your question, is product alignment. Does the government need what you're selling, or is it a Me Too thing? And I think if in the course of your POVs or wherever, how SaaS companies are doing it, you get to see that. You get to see if eyes are popping, or it's kind of a shoulder shrugging experience. I think in the situation where something is revealed that they didn't know previously, whether it's in security or not, whether they maybe had a false sense of security, and then during the POV, they experience something really particularly compelling. I think that's always the case, which is, if that's the case and it makes it good for the taxpayer, makes it better for the stakeholders and the policymakers and the governor, then if all those vectors line up, things move fast.
So there's pain, and they understand that they need to move. And from a procurement perspective, maybe this kind of goes back to your point before, but like and that agency or that entity is comfortable using a contract that's existing.
Yeah. I mean, during COVID, where multi-factor and identity were now big. That was, like I said before, that was kind of a forcing function that said we need to get a solution. But outside of a natural event like that, then I think whatever those compelling things are, and I know SaaS companies and every sales company is always trying to talk about compelling events. But I think there are some that are really particularly compelling to not only like I said before, the technology decision makers and the CIOs, but to the policymakers. I think when those vectors line up, that makes for a much better, and we've certainly seen that, right? I could give you anecdote after anecdote of when we plug into an environment and, there was a previous false sense of security and things are revealed. That's a compelling thing. That's a real compelling thing, because nobody wants to see citizen data compromised, certainly, or any data compromised. And that's always top of mind. I mean, cyber is always a big one because of that element. But that's, if you ask me, where you have those things, that's where that time to close gets a lot better.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. Last thing I wanted to ask you about was kind of the direct versus channel relationship, and how you've seen
put me on the spot.
How you've seen people do that well. Talk to us a little bit about that. There's definitely like an important place for channel partners for a lot of reasons. There's obviously important reasons to have an investment in your direct go-to-market team as well. What do you think are the themes or the frameworks for how revenue leaders like you, who run PubSec for a SaaS company that has both a private sector and a public sector business, like how should those revenue leaders think about that channel versus direct balance?
Yeah. So in Wiz public sector, we are 100% channel, and that's because contract vehicles and the partners that we have that are on those contract vehicles provide that value. So there's one kind of leg of the stool. The other leg of the stool is that we're a limited number of people here. The way we get to scale is through partners who have relationships in all the various state and local entities. I think of which there is like over 200,000. So there's only I think 7 sellers on our sled team right now. So we always need to augment that. So we like to incent top of funnel activity, as we call it, which is we reward those who bring us into opportunities. We can't do that without a good partner community, for sure. I think there has been some signals, at least on the federal side, that may be changing over time. We'll see how that plays out. Consolidation of costs, leveraging the overall buying power of the federal government as one, may be a future trend that will cause some disruption. But I think at the end of the day, for people in my seat, it's all about scale. How do we do it? How do we find more opportunities? And then how do we contract with the government? And I think right now that is 100% through our partner community.
Totally. Dean, this has been awesome, man. I've learned a lot by working with you. Super grateful to have the relationship that we have, and also with Dave and the rest of your team. Thanks for joining today, and we'll see you out there.
You bet, Mike. Always.
All right.
Appreciate
Take
it, man.
care.